Welcome back to yet another video on Daniel 11. So far, we've seen that Daniel 11 can be neatly divided into two sections, verses 3 to 39, which is historically accurate because Daniel is simply recording past events. He's most likely drawing upon the historical records of his day, and that's why he's so accurate. And then we have verses 40 to 45, which are historically inaccurate. And this is most likely because Daniel is trying, but unfortunately failing, to make actual predictions about the future. A question we're going to keep asking ourselves in this video is what's inspiring these false predictions? Surely Daniel is drawing upon something when making these false predictions. What is the inspiration for verses 40 to 45? So to answer that question, let's begin by delving into these two inaccurate predictions. The first of which is the 7th Syrian War, and the next is Antiochus's death in Israel, both of which never happened. As Hartman writes very forcefully, quote, "The present section contains no historical information at all, but purports rather to be a genuine prediction of events to happen after this apocalypse was composed and presumably circulated among the faithful." The trouble is that nothing in these verses matches the actual course of history as it is known from other sources. This untoward situation has caused believers through the centuries great difficulty, and unusual interpretations, however well-intentioned and prompted as they were by deep faith in sacred scripture, were put forward in a misguided attempt to salvage the inerrancy of the biblical text, unquote. Okay, with that very forceful quote from Hartman right there, let's now delve into the text. Before we jump into the content here, I just want to take a moment to thank my patrons who make these videos possible. Remember, the goal of this channel is to create a library of videos that objectively analyze the Bible. If that's something you consider important, can I encourage you to become a patron today? If you do so, you will receive access to my full videos. All right, let's get back to the content now. So we're dealing with the 7th Syrian War in this video. But before we delve into the 7th Syrian War, let's just take a step back and remind ourselves of the actual historical event before this, which was the 6th Syrian War. This is when Antiochus IV invades Ptolemy, and he actually manages to conquer most of Egypt. But what ends up happening is that Rome steps in. And we have the famous Day of Ulysses, in which Antiochus is humiliated and he's forced to retreat home, and he promises Rome he won't attack Egypt again. We're now going to move into the inaccurate history here, which is the 7th Syrian War. Daniel describes this in verse 40, which reads, quote, "At the time of the end." Can we just stop here for a moment, people? It says, "at the time of the end," meaning Daniel believes that what he's about to describe is the end of the world. As Newsom writes, quote, "Now verse 40 announces that the time of the end has arrived and the final movement of history is to unfold." I think that's really important to keep in mind. When Daniel is recounting verses 40 to 45, he sees this as the end of the world. Okay, let's keep that in the back of our mind and keep on reading. So verse 40 says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south, which is Ptolemy, shall attack him. But the king of the north, which is Antiochus, shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. He shall advance against countries and pass through like a flood." End quote. So here we're told that Ptolemy is going to initiate the 7th Syrian War, but then Antiochus retaliates and defeats Ptolemy. As Siao writes in his commentary, the author now predicts that the Ptolemies will launch a new attack on their old enemy in the north, and that Antiochus will undertake a massive retaliation. Verse 40, end quote. Okay, let me remind you that we have no historical proof for this event at all. As Hartman writes, quote, "There is no mention at all in the extant ancient sources for the war predicted in verse 40. In fact, after the ultimatum Antiochus received from the Roman legate Pompilius in 168, it appears extremely unlikely that the tyrant would return to Egypt, thereby risking military intervention by Rome." End quote. So here Hartman is reminding us of the Day of Ulysses, which we spoke about previously. This is when Antiochus promised he would not invade Egypt again. So it is odd that here in verse 40, so soon after Antiochus made this agreement to Rome, that he would invade again, especially knowing that Rome would defend Egypt. Nevertheless, let's keep on reading here. We're now going to look at verses 41 and 42, which reads, quote, "He, Antiochus, shall come into the beautiful land." Again, let's just pause here for a moment. This reference to the beautiful land is undoubtedly a reference to Israel. Israel is the beautiful land. Okay, let's keep on reading. He, Antiochus, shall come into the beautiful land, and tens of thousands shall fall victim. But Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites shall escape from his power. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. End quote. Okay, we have a very interesting passage here. Let's remind ourselves what has just happened. So, we're told that the 7th Syrian War begins by Ptolemy attacking Antiochus. Antiochus then pushes Ptolemy back into Egypt. And of course, by doing so, Antiochus goes through Israel, the beautiful land. And obviously, as he goes through Israel, we have a huge wave of violence in this area. And we're told that tens of thousands shall fall victim in the beautiful land. But the text also tells us that Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites shall escape from his power. What on earth is that saying to us? Well, it's telling us that Israel's neighbors, so that is Edom, Moab, and Ammon, are not going to be attacked by Antiochus, which most likely means they have made some sort of alliance with Antiochus. As Siao writes, the Transjordanian states of Moab and Edom and Ammon, traditional enemies of Israel, will escape, no doubt because they will ally themselves with Antiochus, verse 41, end quote. Now, hopefully you realize something very odd here. Daniel 11 has not really mentioned any other countries by name up to this point. So why, all of a sudden, is he mentioning these specific countries? To put the question succinctly, why does Daniel 11:40-45 mention other nations? Let's keep that in mind while we continue to read. So we now go into verse 43, which says, He, Antiochus, shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and of all the riches of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow in his train. End quote. So in this verse, we are told that Antiochus will completely conquer Egypt, meaning he's going to take over all of this area here. It will be under Seleucid control. What's also interesting is that we're told about the Libyans and the Ethiopians, whom Antiochus also conquers. Ethiopia is the country also known as Cush in the Bible, and it's to the south of Egypt. And Libya is also known as Put in the Bible, and it is to the west of Egypt. Again, it's very odd that Daniel 11 is mentioning these countries by name, because he hasn't done so up to this point. This is noted by Newsom, who writes, the mention of Libya and Ethiopia is also curious, since the author generally avoids actual geographic designations with the exception of verse 8, end quote. So this brings us back to that same question yet again, which is why does Daniel 11:40-45 mention other nations? Keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to keep on reading through. We're now going to go on to verse 44, which reads as follows, But reports from the east and north shall alarm him, Antiochus, and he shall go out with great fury to bring ruin and complete destruction to many. Okay, so here we're told that Antiochus is going to hear reports from the east and the north. So the east would most likely refer to Persia, and the north, just to the north of Israel there. So again, we're in this strange position where all of a sudden, Daniel 11 is mentioning other territories. Why is he doing this? You know, we now have Ammon and Moab and Edom and the north and east and Libya and Ethiopia. All of a sudden, Daniel 11 wants to mention all of these other nations, which is very, very odd. So let's again ask ourselves, why does Daniel 11:40-45 mention other nations? Because it's only in verses 40-45 that Daniel is making these references to other nations. In verses 3-39, he only references the king of the north and the king of the south. That's the only thing Daniel cares about. But now he wants to mention all of these other nations. Why is this the case? Well, the most likely reason is because in verse 40-45, Daniel believes he's giving us an account of the end of the world. And the final battle of history, as described in the Hebrew Bible, involves all of the nations coming against Israel. So when we come to answering this question, why does Daniel 11:40-45 mention other nations? It's most likely because he's drawing upon the book of Ezekiel. And the book of Ezekiel is going to tell us about this final battle of history. As Newsom writes, quote, "The author may be adapting the notion of the gathering of nations for the final battle, especially the nations that follow Gog in Ezekiel 38. All right, what exactly is that telling to us here? Well, in Ezekiel 38, we're told about this guy called Gog, and he is from the land of Magog. So it's Gog of Magog. This is this person here. And he appears in the final days, and he gets all of the nations of the world to attack Israel. So the final battle of history involves all of the nations of the world attacking Israel, and Gog is kind of leading this revolt against Israel. We read this in Ezekiel 38, quote, "The word of the Lord came to me, mortal, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, Thus says the Lord God, I am against you, O Gog, chief priest of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and put hooks into your jaw. I will lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great company of them with shield and buckler, wielding swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Put, which is Libya, are with them, all of them with buckler and helmet. Gomer and all its truth, Beth Togarmah, from the remotest parts of the north, with all of its troops, many peoples are with you." End quote. All right, take note that some of the nations mentioned in Daniel 11 are specifically mentioned here in Ezekiel 38, which is very interesting. Now, this idea that all of the nations at the end time would attack Israel is found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, in Zechariah 14, we read, "See, a day is coming for the Lord, when the plunder taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all of the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken." So now returning to Daniel chapter 11, the reason why Daniel is making mention of these other nations is because he's framing this event as the final battle of history. As Newsom writes, quote, "The author invokes the paradigm of the eschatological battle against Judah and Jerusalem, as described in the post-exilic prophets, especially the invasion by Gog in Ezekiel 38 and the gathering of all nations against Jerusalem in Zechariah 14:2." End quote. So now let's return to what we began with at the very beginning of this video. We were trying to ask the question, what was inspiring Daniel's account of verses 40 to 45? And I think we can pretty confidently say that the book of Ezekiel, specifically the description of the battle of Gog, is what is informing Daniel when he's predicting the future events of 40 to 45. And even though Daniel is incorrect in his predictions, we can see that he's motivated by his readings of Ezekiel. All right, we have in this video given a really thorough breakdown of the 7th Syrian War. And we've seen that what Daniel is trying to do here is get us to link together in our brains Gog and Antiochus IV. What we're going to be doing in our next video is looking at the death of Antiochus in Israel. And we're again going to see that Daniel is trying to equate Gog with Antiochus IV yet again. I hope that you join me in that next exciting video. Can I end by thanking all my patrons and YouTube members who make these videos possible? Make sure you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and make sure you're subscribed. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.